Picture this. You're a Persian surgeon, standing in the wreckage after the first day of fighting at Thermopylae. Smoke still hangs in the air. The ground is a slick mess of blood and dust, and on your table is the body of a Greek soldier. Not one of the famous ones with the crimson cloak. This man is rougher, broader, calloused hands. The kind of fighter who looks like he's been wrestling stone his whole life. You cut open his travel pouch, expecting something normal, coins, wine rations, dried meat. Instead, you find a handful of hard, bitter acorns. You freeze. Because in the civilized world of 480 BC, acorns are pig food, not human food. And yet the man lying here didn't die starving. He died fighting like a wild animal. You've just met a balanovagos, an acorn eater. That was the sneering nickname the polished Greeks used for the people of Arcadia. And right now, thousands of these so-called pig-eaters are on the other side of the wall, screaming for your blood. History sold you a lie about a pristine suicide squad of 300 perfect super soldiers. The real Thermopylae was a gritty, multicultural meat grinder, where the line was held not just by Spartan discipline, but by the desperate, savage endurance of the Arcadians. And before we step into those forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you like learning the hidden truths of history, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It still blows my mind that we can dig into these ancient stories together. People scattered across the planet, connected through time by the same curiosity. Now let's strip away the Hollywood filter, because the moment you zoom out from King Leonidas and his royal guard, Thermopylae changes instantly. It stops being a dramatic duel and becomes what it really was, a massive, congested brawl. The pass, the hot gates, wasn't just a stage for Spartan glory. It was a logistical choke point clogged with nearly 7,000 Greek soldiers. 7,000. That number changes everything. It turns a doomed last stand into an actual tactical blockade. Pop culture obsesses over the 300 Spartans and conveniently ignores the roughly 2,120 Arcadians who stood shoulder to shoulder with them. For every red cloak in the line, there were men from the highlands. Tegea, Mantinea, or Comines, thick-legged mountain fighters who didn't look cinematic enough to survive the edit. And this matters, because a phalanx isn't a collection of individuals. It's a shove. It's physics. Mass, friction, pressure. 300 men, no matter how elite, have a strict limit on how much weight they can put into that wall. Against a Persian force numbering in the hundreds of thousands, a line of 300 would be lighter than paper. They'd be trampled, flanked, or simply pushed backward by the raw kinetic force of the crowd crashing into them. To hold the pass, Leonidas needed ballast. He needed heavy, immovable weight to anchor his line. The Arcadians were that anchor. Geography forged them into the perfect defensive weapon. Sparta sits in a valley, open, fertile, confident. Arcadia is a fortress. Jagged limestone peaks, dense forests, steep trails, wolves in the dark. The Greeks said the Arcadians were older than the moon itself, proselenes before the moon. While Spartans spent their days oiling their bodies and drilling in synchronized perfection, Arcadians spent their lives climbing vertical slopes, herding goats, cutting wood, and fighting off predators. Their legs were iron cords. Their lungs were built for thin mountain air. When the call came in 480 BC, these men didn't march north chasing glory. They marched because survival was on the line. But their presence created tension inside the Greek camp. You had Spartans, the aristocrats of war, armed with state-sponsored bronze, fighting beside men who often couldn't afford a full suit of armor. Men who sometimes padded their rations with acorns. That class divide is the invisible thread running through Thermopylae. The Spartans were there to lead. The Arcadians were there to work. When the coalition reached the pass, they found the old Phocian wall in ruins, crumbled limestone, weeds pushing through the cracks. It wasn't some ready-made fortress. It was a broken pile that needed to become a barrier immediately. So who rebuilt it? Leonidas and his royal guard probably didn't stoop to hauling stone. That back-breaking labor fell to the common soldiers, the Arcadians and other allies, stacking rocks that would soon decide whether they lived or died. And erasing the Arcadians from the story doesn't just skew the numbers. It insults the nature of Greek resistance. It suggests courage belongs only to elites. But Thermopylae wasn't clean. It wasn't pure. It was a patchwork defense, an alliance held together by necessity, grit, and fear. The acorn eaters didn't have the luxury of a romantic death wish. They fought because they had to. And when the killing started, they didn't hide behind Spartans. They stood beside them, taking turns in the front, trading blows with the immortals, only to be forgotten later because they didn't have Sparta's propaganda machine. So we're going to walk into the fire with them. We're going to see the battle through their eyes, smell what they smelled, understand why the line held, and why the world forgot the men who helped hold it. But first, to understand Thermopylae, you have to understand Arcadia. Look at a topographical map of the Peloponnese and you'll see it. A jagged claw of mountains tearing through the center of the peninsula. That's Arcadia. Landlocked, harsh, unforgiving. Ancient Greece's version of Switzerland, minus the neutrality and the banks. The Greeks had a saying, if you need a war, buy an Arcadian. Because for centuries, Arcadia's primary export wasn't olive oil or pottery. It was violence. Their soil was too rocky to feed everyone, so the surplus of young men left home to fight as mercenaries, Sicily, Asia Minor, even for enemies of Greece. They became the premier hired guns of the ancient world, famous for grim professionalism and an ability to endure misery that would break most soldiers. Which is exactly why their presence at Thermopylae is so extraordinary. Because this time, they weren't marching for pay. They were marching because they understood extinction. And that is where the real story begins. When Leonidas called for aid, the Arcadians didn't demand their usual wage. No contracts, no promised looting rights, no neat business terms carved into stone. For a people who treated war like a transaction, this was a shift so deep it almost sounds unreal. They marched north not for profit, but because they could finally see what was coming, something bigger than any border raid or petty rivalry. The Persian threat wasn't a normal war. It was a flood. And floods don't stop at city limits. They drown mountains just as easily as valleys. Leading the Arcadian contingent were hoplites from Plataea and Mantinea, two heavyweights of Arcadia who normally hated each other with a passion that often burned hotter than their hatred of outsiders. In almost any other year, Plataeans and Mantineans would be killing each other over grazing rights, border stones, and old grudges. But at the hot gates, they stood in the same shield wall. The Plataeans, around 500, arrived with a chip on their shoulder. They had a long, bloody history of fighting Sparta to a standstill, something few Greeks could claim. They didn't fear Leonidas. They respected him the way you respect a dangerous peer. Then came the Mantineans, another 500, determined to outdo their rivals. That internal rivalry inside the Arcadian ranks became its own weapon. Neither group could afford to look weak in front of the other. and definitely not in front of the Spartans. So the battlefield became a grim contest where the prize wasn't gold. It was bragging rights. Culturally, these men weren't just another Greek ally. They saw themselves as something older. They called themselves proselenes, people who existed before the moon. Their myths weren't polite marble statues and perfect temples. Their stories were wild. They traced their lineage to Arcas, son of Callisto, who was turned into a bear. They were the people of the bear. And that identity mattered because it shaped how they fought. Greek warfare, at least in the idealized version, was rigid formation, order, discipline. The Spartans perfected that mechanical precision, but Arcadia wasn't built for flat, predictable battles. It was steep slopes, fractured terrain, tight passes, ambush points, and close-range grappling in forests. The Arcadians brought a different flavor into the Phalanx. They brought aggression. While a Spartan might lock in and hold position like a gear in a machine, an Arcadian was more likely to surge forward with raw mountain momentum, less polished, more feral. Their patron god was Pan, goat-legged, wild, the god of panic. Not strategic warfare like Athena. Panic. That sudden, irrational fear that grips you in deep woods or in the crush of battle. When the Arcadians marched to Thermopylae, they brought that chaotic energy with them. So imagine the contrast inside the camp. On one side, Spartans in silence, combing long hair, moving with calm ritual, doing calisthenics like it's a ceremony. On the other, over 2,000 Arcadians, rough-hammered men, speaking a thick hill country dialect, sharpening weapons that had already seen service in foreign wars. They probably didn't look at the Spartans with awe. They looked at them like contractors looking at a client, because they understood the business of killing. And still, a simple logistical truth bound them together. The Arcadians were heavy infantry, hoplites. They carried the aspis, big round shield, and the dory, the thrusting spear. But unlike the uniform Spartan kit, Arcadian equipment was mixed and personal. A helmet might be a battered Corinthian style passed down through generations. A breastplate might be linen instead of bronze. Some had beautiful armor, others wore stiffened cloth or leather. In the crush of a phalanx, that didn't matter. What mattered was weight. We talk about the phalanx like it's an abstract concept, but physically it works like a rugby scrum. Men lean into the men in front of them, driving the wall forward with sheer mass. The Arcadians provided the horsepower. With over 2,000 men, their depth made the formation real. Without them, the Spartan line would have been too shallow, too light. The physics of the battle depended on the muscle mass of those highland bodies. Leonidas knew it. He didn't bring them along as spectators. He brought them because he needed the bear to guard the flanks. He needed men who'd turned war into an industry to now turn it into a defense. And the Arcadians, setting aside greed, setting aside hatred, tightened their shield straps and prepared to do what they did best: bleed for a cause. Only this time, the cause was their own. By the spring of 480 BC, the world wasn't feeling tense. It was ending. Not as a vague prophecy, but as a visible reality creeping in from the east. Xerxes, the king of kings, launched the largest invasion force anyone had ever seen. Herodotus claims the Persian army drank rivers dry as it marched. Even if you strip away the exaggeration, the message was unmistakable: submit or burn. Greece froze. The oracle at Delphi spat out doom. Athenians told to flee. Spartans told their king must die. Panic became currency. And in that terror, The city-states gathered at the Isthmus of Corinth to decide how to stop the apocalypse. The logic was simple. Find a choke point. Find a cork to plug the bottle. Thermopylae was that cork. But knowing where to fight was easy. Finding the men was the problem. And this brings us to the Spartan complication. When the call to arms went out, Sparta was in the middle of the Carnaea, a sacred festival honoring Apollo. Spartan law was rigid. No military campaigns during the Carnaea. To march was to invite divine wrath. It was the ultimate bureaucratic shield. And the Spartan leadership, especially the ephors, hesitated. They feared a slave revolt at home as much as they feared Persians abroad. Leonidas understood something they were trying to avoid. Xerxes didn't care about Sparta's religious calendar. If Thermopylae fell before the festival ended, the war was over. So Leonidas found a loophole. He framed his march not as a full deployment, but as an advance guard, almost like a personal bodyguard mission. He chose 300 men who already had living sons, ensuring their bloodlines wouldn't end if they died. But Leonidas was a pragmatist, not a fool. He knew 300 men alone were useless tactically. They were a symbol, a diplomatic message to prove Sparta was committed. To actually hold the pass, he needed muscle. He needed the Arcadians. And the negotiation that followed was less a friendly alliance and more a tense standoff. Spartan messengers went into the Arcadian highlands with a challenge that was basically a provocation. Our king is marching to die for Greece. Are the sons of the bear brave enough to follow, or will you hide in your caves? It was emotional manipulation, and it worked. The proud warrior castes of Tegea and Mantinea couldn't allow their rivals to label them cowards, and they couldn't let Sparta claim sole guardianship of the Peloponnese. Still, the decision was full of suspicion. The Arcadians knew Sparta's reputation. They'd been on the receiving end of Spartan aggression for generations. They suspected Leonidas might use them as a buffer, a fleshy wall to protect precious Spartan citizens. And honestly, that fear wasn't crazy. In Greek warfare, allies often got shoved into the risky spots while elites held the safest ground. But the Persian threat was so enormous, it forced their hand. Councils across Arcadia voted to mobilize. It was harvest season, and they had their own festivals too. So they didn't send everyone. They sent their best, and the mustering must have been a sight. From the south came the Spartans, moving with terrifying silent uniformity, bronze shining, crimson cloaks identical, shields polished like mirrors. Then pouring down from the mountain tracks came the Arcadians, louder, less uniform, a sea of different crests and shield designs, no warm embrace. These men were neighbors, not friends. Spartans saw Arcadians as unrefined hill people. Arcadians saw Spartans as arrogant oppressors. But when they looked north toward Xerxes, those differences got shoved aside. Leonidas took command of the mixed force. For the Arcadians, serving under a Spartan king gave the mission legitimacy. They assumed kings didn't throw their lives away for nothing. They believed there was a plan, a reinforcement army coming. They didn't know Leonidas had likely already accepted his own death, and he wasn't telling them the full extent of what waited at the hot gates. The coalition that marched north, roughly 7,000 men, was a fragile organism. The Arcadians formed its spine, and as they left the safety of their mountains for a narrow strip of coastland, the reality started to sink in. They were trusting their lives to a king who, metaphorically, had already packed his burial shroud, and they were about to find out if Sparta was as good as it claimed. and if the sons of the bear could stop the sun from rising in the east. History loves to draw clean arrows across maps. But for the men walking north, the march to Thermopylae was anything but clean. The distance from the isthmus to the hot gates is roughly 200 kilometers. For a modern vehicle, that's a morning drive. For men carrying nearly 70 pounds of bronze, wood, and leather under the Greek sun, it was slow, grinding misery. And this march gave us our first real look at how different these allies truly were. The Spartans moved in near silence. Their gear was standardized, maintained by state slaves trailing the baggage train. Shields gleamed, cloaks matched perfectly. They marched like a single organism, a machine designed for war. Then came the Arcadians. Their column was loud, colorful, chaotic. Because they supplied their own equipment, there was no uniformity. A wealthy Mantinean noble might stride forward in a full bronze cuirass rivaling any Spartan, while the man beside him, a goat herder from a mountain village, wore a stiffened linen thorax or thick leather tunic. But the great equalizer was the aspis. That 3-foot-wide shield forced cooperation. In a phalanx, your shield protected your left side and the right side of the man next to you, which meant a Spartan aristocrat's life might depend entirely on a battered Arcadian farmer's shield. The march forced intimacy. They breathed the same dust, drank from the same muddy streams, slept on the same hard ground. Tensions flared most when they made camp. Spartans ate in tight, exclusive messes, consuming their infamous black broth, pork, blood, vinegar, claiming it gave them strength. The Arcadians, used to scavenging and hunting, roasted whatever meat they could find, likely mocking the Spartan slurry while chewing in the firelight. These weren't petty differences. They were fault lines. As the army neared the Malian Gulf, the land tightened. Mountains squeezed closer to the sea, funneling them toward their destination. When they finally arrived, Thermopylae wasn't a fortress waiting to be defended. It was a disappointment. The middle gate, the narrowest point, was marked by the ruins of an ancient Phocian wall, a crumbling pile of limestone overgrown with weeds, hardly a barrier for the greatest army on earth. And once again, the class divide became physical. While Leonidas and his officers surveyed terrain and kill zones, the labor fell to the rank and file. Arcadian strongmen, hardened by forestry and stonework, hauled massive blocks into place, sweating and cursing while Spartans supervised. The acorn eaters were building the cage they might soon die in. But that labor mattered. It gave them ownership. They weren't defending an abstract map coordinate. They were defending a wall built with their own hands. By the time it stood 6 feet high, just enough to break cavalry, just low enough to fight over, the Persian vanguard arrived. And the psychological impact was crushing. Even conservative estimates put Xerxes' land force between 100,000 and 300,000 men, backed by over 1,000 ships. For Arcadians used to enclosed valleys, the sight was incomprehensible. At night, Persian campfires stretched to the horizon like fallen stars. The noise alone was terrifying. Camels braying, foreign languages clashing, the constant hum of massed humanity. This is where the famous scout story happens. A Persian scout rode forward and reported seeing Greeks exercising and combing their hair. Xerxes laughed, assuming he faced a tiny, vain suicide squad. What the scout didn't see, what Xerxes failed to calculate, were the thousands of Arcadians and allies camped behind the wall. They weren't grooming. They were sharpening blades, tightening straps, praying to Pan. The hidden variable in the equation. The first day of battle proved it. When the Persian infantry charged, they didn't hit individuals. They slammed into a machine. Bronze smashed, wood snapped, thousands of lungs emptied at once. The Spartans took the first shift, efficient, surgical, stabbing eyes and throats. But even Spartans tire. That's when the rotation happened. Tegeans, Mantineans, forward. Now the Persians faced the bear. The Arcadians hit with brutal aggression. Rival cities competed inside the killing zone, pushing harder, refusing to be the first to yield. Persian dead piled so high the Greeks had to climb over bodies to keep formation. By day's end, Xerxes watched his army evaporate. Day 2 was worse. The pass became a charnel house. Heat bloated corpses. Flies filled the air. The stink was overwhelming. The immortals advanced, silent, masked, terrifying, and they bled. Spears shattered. Fighting devolved into grappling, knives, hands, teeth. This chaos suited the Arcadians perfectly. They dragged immortals into the shield wall and butchered them. And something else broke that day. The class divide. You can't look down on a man who just saved your life. Spartans and Arcadians became brothers in blood, an impossible alliance forged in shared horror. Then came betrayal. A local shepherd showed Xerxes the Plataea path, the back door through the mountains. The Phocians guarding it panicked and withdrew. By dawn, the Greeks were surrounded. Leonidas didn't order a mass suicide. He dismissed the army. Someone had to stay to delay the Persians. The rest had to live, so Greece could fight again. The Arcadians obeyed, and that obedience became their curse. They marched away carrying survivors' guilt, while Spartans and Thespians stayed to die. History remembered the crimson cloaks. It forgot the bear. But the Arcadians didn't forget. A year later at Plataea, they returned, not as mercenaries, not as auxiliaries, but as executioners. They charged when Spartans hesitated. They broke the Persian stockade when Spartans stalled. Herodotus names them Tegea, Mantinea, Orchomenus. They earned redemption in iron and blood. So why do we only remember the 300? Because history isn't what happened. It's what people chose to remember. And Sparta curated its legend perfectly. The Arcadians left no sound bites, no slogans, just dented shields and broken spears. But the truth is this: the 300 were never alone. They stood on the shoulders of the bear, and Thermopylae wasn't held by heroes alone, but by forgotten men who did the heavy lifting, took the arrows, and walked away so the world could keep fighting. That is the story worth remembering.